taught several of these classes before. The first slide you're seeing is I won this wonderful prestigious award along with other many very talented people in the ICAA, the Texas chapter. This is an award I got last month for a watercolor travel sketch of Hotel Beauvais. I'm very honored to have this award again. Travel sketch. This is actually drawn in person, not from photographs. So I just thought I thought you might like to see something, and I've actually drawn up. Today we're going to be talking about proportions of the classical orders. Last week we talked about the details, the moldings, and how the classical orders were actually composed and proportioned. We're going to get into a little bit more information about that. So let's try to hold our questions off till the end of the lecture. So again, we're talking about proportions. These are just some topics, learning outcomes. I'm not going to read all these to you. Just some of the definitions. What is a canon of proportion? My favorite question is, what is beauty? How on earth is beauty defined in sort of any realm of aesthetics, art or architecture or music or the arts? We're going to talk about Vitruvius, the golden section. And then, of course, you'll have the PDF after class to refer to these. So there's quite a bit of information. Hopefully you guys are taking notes or either have your sketchbooks handy. There are some images I like you to start sketching if you have the time. I'll give you plenty of time. So let's talk about what we briefly talked about earlier in the week, just to kind of get everyone on board. Again, I mentioned that there's really three basic orders: Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. There's, of course, in the Roman times, Tuscan was introduced, and then in Renaissance, the composite order on the right was introduced during the Renaissance. So there's really five basic orders: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and composite, with an infinite number of variations. Many architects reinterpret these things. At the end of the lecture, there's a list of writings and publications where you can find how to properly draw and scale these things on your own. So what I mentioned last time is, I'm not going to get into all the details we talked about again, but for the most part, pretty much all the orders are really based off of the diameter of the columns. These crazy curves and circles are really showing you that each column has its own dimension in terms of height based on how many diameters the column has. So this chart shows, let me go back to this one. So again, the Tuscan columnar order has 7 diameters tall to determine the height. Doric has 8, Ionic has 9, Corinthian and composite have 10 diameters to determine the height. So that's what this chart is showing you. This is kind of an answer to a question I had last week, is that if you aligned all the columnar orders together in one register, would the diameters change? Well, I think in this chart you can see that based on the number of diameters, of course, the thickness of the column will change. Obviously, the Tuscan is the fattest order, and then by the Renaissance and the 1st century classicism AD in Rome, is that the columns became thinner and much taller, because of course they're able to engineer and maximize the structural integrity and minimize the material of the stone or the marble. That was our lecture last week, which I do have PDFs. I can email each one of the students these. But again, what I was saying is everything is really based on the diameter of the column. Every little piece. There's only 4 parts to every sort of classical order: the columnar shaft with a number of diameters based on Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, and composite. Then, of course, the 3 parts that comprise the entablature, which of course is the large beam. And if I'm going too fast, please don't hesitate to ask me to slow down, but this kind of was in the lecture. I'm just kind of regurgitating what we talked about. Really, the entire top piece of the building comprises into 3 parts: the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice, which is called the entablature. So again, the ancient Greeks were very methodical about how everything proportioned on the diameter of the column. Every little square piece corner is based off a ratio of a width of the diameter of each one of the columns. Okay, so we're going to talk about proportioning. How do you proportion things? I've mentioned the columnar diameters are, of course, proportioned based on the number of heights for the columns. We're going to be showing how the columns orders are applied to particularly facades. And what does that mean versus Greek architecture versus Roman architecture? There's really 2 distinctive styles. We're going to start with what's called intercolumnation. It means the spacing in between the columns. If you look at a Roman Doric, you can see that the spacing of the columns is really based on how many triglyphs there are in between the columns. Monotriglyph is really one triglyph. The spacing gets larger. There's 2, then of course there's 3, 4. Really in Greek architecture, really weren't able to span that far. And of course, you know, the architecture, because we're not building with arches, we're simply building a post and lintel columnar structure. Post and lintel means the columns are the post, the lintel is the beam. And by that, I mean in Greek architecture and space, the space was limited because you really couldn't span that far with marble and stone because the lintels would not allow a larger span. So you had to have an infinite number of, extremely large number of columns to span an opening this far. Later when we get into Roman architecture, it's very different because they're building with arches that are filled with concrete. So in Roman architecture, it really frees up the spatial dynamics. You don't need quite as many columns as you do in Greek architecture and space. Of course, this is the Ionic order. So we talk about proportions in Roman architecture. It's very different. The columns are, because of course, much further apart because we don't need as many columns to span an opening. We're having arches, which of course can span much further. So the distance between the columns in Roman architecture is much further apart than Greek architecture because you can see that the arch lends itself for a much wider opening. And let's just kind of ignore the geometric relationships that we're showing. We'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. And again, if I'm going too fast, please allow me to slow down. There's quite a few slides. I think everyone's microphone is muted, but if you want to answer a question or ask something, you have to turn your microphone on. But again, hold your questions to the very end of the lecture. You know, this is a crazy diagram, nothing but circles and curves. But they're showing you that pretty much a facade is really designed relative to the classical order. This is probably the Corinthian order. You can see that the diameters are roughly about 10 diameters tall with the pedestal base, which we'll talk about in a minute. And pretty much all the parts in the facade are really based on the diameter of the columnar order. So you'd have a very different ratio of proportioning if you're using Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian order. This is just a very, I know, a very confusing image, but I'm just showing you that but the way facades are designed are very carefully laid out and proportioned based on which classical order you're designing with. So when we're talking about, you know, some larger ideas, what is proportion? What is a proportioning system? I'm sure you've heard of a canon of proportion. Of course, as a rule, a set of disciplines. The ancient Greeks had a very severe and regimented set of disciplines to determine the proportion of the scale of everything. A Greek temple front, the columns, the spacing, the proportions, everything. You can pretty much identify the proportion of any building, any classical Renaissance facade just by using numbers or a series of squares or rectangles, particularly the golden section. I'm sure you've probably seen this in your history classes, your art classes, your architecture classes. A ratio of length, width, height, and depth that relate to each other is a proportioning system, which we've loosely seen in the first couple of slides. Then my favorite question is beauty. How is beauty defined? Really, in this course, beauty is defined as relationships. In classical art, it's architecture, Renaissance, there was a mathematical ratio for beauty, partially based on the golden section. So when you look at classical Renaissance facades, they visibly look beautiful, not because it's a subjective term, just because they're using math and geometry to define what beauty actually is. It's not a subjective term at all. So the ratio of length to width are relative to each other based on the proportions of the early columns diagrams that we saw in Greece and Roman architecture. So really in this class, beauty is defined as relationships, ratios that relate to one part and another. Okay, again, what's beautiful about this particular order is that what's beautiful about it is every little part is relative to the column's diameter. It's not arbitrarily created. Everything has a reason for being. I'm just going to briefly get into some sort of ancient geometrical principles. The section of the Pantheon in Rome, of course, has the entire nave of this, this building fits into a full circle. So again, the proportion is a very simple full circle. The entablature that divides the dome and the facades is simply the midpoint between the circles. Beautiful, very simple organizational skills. Then, of course, the interior columns, the facades, are based on the classical orders which were established hundreds of years before in the Greek sort of classical orders. So then we're going to talk about, proportioning versus the golden section rectangle. The golden section rectangle, which we'll see some graphic images in it, is really, based on ancient geometric principles. If you're familiar with Fibonacci, the Italian mathematician, that he's the one that actually organized everything in nature based on a numbering system. If you look at the numbering system, 1, 2, you add the consecutive number before that, then of course it gradually gets larger, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, you add 13 and 21, you get 34. So Fibonacci was the Italian mathematician that reintroduced this numbering system and the golden section in the Western world. Right before, remarkable, this is created in the Dark Ages before the Renaissance. So before I start boring everyone, I'm just going to show you some images and some graphics on how that's actually applied in terms of graphics and drawings. We've seen this obviously is the facade of the Greek Parthenon in Athens. There are some secrets about the way the proportions are determined. Probably this entire facade fits into the golden section rectangle. I'm assuming that was highly intended because it's just a little bit strange that someone would superimpose the golden section. It just would arbitrarily wind up relating to the facade in the golden section. I'm sure this was originally designed with this geometric proportioning system. So how is the golden section constructed? And this is not the way all architecture, facades, and plans are created. This is really one graphic proportioning system. So what you do is you take a square, and with a compass, you can divide the midpoint in the square. Then you take the compass's radius from the midpoint to the corner, and of course the arc determines the other parameters of the rectangle. So what you're looking at is the compass really determines the proportion of the rectangle. So the length becomes a little bit over 1.5. 1.618 is the width after the compass determines the size of the rectangle for you. So this is 1 for the height, then the length eventually becomes 1.618. This is a golden rectangle that is very evident and created on facades. We just saw the front of the Parthenon, which of course uses the golden section based on starting with the square. Normally I would have taken this image, this is from my studio desktop, scan it into Photoshop and make it look really clean and crisp, but I just love the subtle shadows cast from the compass. I think it's a little bit more visibly intriguing than just scanning it into Photoshop and making it clear, especially definitely not drawn on a computer. You can see the texture in the paper that's drawn by hand. So let's, this is getting some very pedantic information. I just was showing you that the Fibonacci spiral can be drawn with just starting out with squares. You can see where it says 1/1. You can start with one square, continue the square, then gradually, consecutively, they will get much larger. 3, 5, 8, 13. So Fibonacci's numbering system does create the golden section rectangle. I'm just going to pause there for a few minutes to let you kind of digest some of the stuff we talked about, just especially the details in the numbers. Again, there will be a PDF sent out with this information. You can probably draw these things on your own time, but I do want to continue with the lecture before we start answering questions. It's just remarkable to think that, ancient and classical geometry, there are specific principles about the way buildings and things are created. They're not just arbitrarily built and designed because they look pretty. There's a more careful drawing of the Fibonacci spiral itself. Okay, so let's move on to something a little bit more sophisticated. If you take a look at the Ionic capital, this is really, relatively Greek Ionic capital because the Greek capitals were flat. The Romans have the 45-degree angles in them. I'm not an expert on that relationship, but I'm pretty sure that's how they're distinguished. How would you proportion, this is, ancient Greece before they had or maybe they did have sophisticated drawing tools, but for the most part, how is this volute created? It's not using golden section spiral, because you've seen the golden section spiral dramatically gets smaller and then larger. If you look at the construction of the volute, it's much more sophisticated than that. I'm not expecting you to draw these in your sketchbook, but it's really loosely based on the Archimedes spiral. Of course, the spiral carefully and slowly gets smaller and smaller as it approaches infinity. What you're looking at is the square diameter, the diagonal on the bottom of the page shows where the radii are located to create each one of the curves. That's a lot of visual information. It's just remarkable to think that these early civilizations had very specific and very calculated way of constructing just what normally is just a spiral, but no, there's a very careful geometric way to proportion the rate of speed that the spiral approaches its smallest diameter. You know, again, the golden section relative to nature, the tendrils and ferns, seashells. This is a very overly complex diagram of the way that some of the classical Greek pavilions were proportioned and determined. Of course, really based on, we've seen the Fibonacci numbering system, which is applied to the golden section rectangle. And of course, we can see 1.618, the number I just associated with that earlier. So let's take a look at how these facades are created. These are Renaissance facades, of course. Remember, the Renaissance is a rebirth of classical systems, proportions, and ideals. So it looks like this is, a wonderful Renaissance architect, Alberti, Basilica of Sant Andrea and Mantua. What he's doing is he's using ancient classical principles to determine the size and proportions of every little part in the facade. So here's a geometric analysis of this. It probably looks like the entire facade is based on a system of squares, but however, if you're analyzing this, you could probably take this rectangle and determine if that is a golden section rectangle. There's probably several different golden section rectangles that fit in between the columns. Now remember earlier that the columnar order is really based on the height of things is based on the number of diameters. So remember that. Let's take a look at, what did the columnar orders do in Roman architecture? Remember what we talked about, the classical orders in Greek architecture were structural. In Roman architecture, they're decorative. These columns really are not structural. But why on earth have the classical orders on Roman architecture if we don't need them for structural integrity? Well, to make a long story short, they give the facade a scale to it. Think of how oppressive, this is a triumphal arch. I think this might be the Arch of Constantine, I'm not sure. But imagine the facade without the classical orders. It'd be very oppressive because it's really hard to tell the scale of this thing without the details in it. Now remember, this is the Corinthian order. So the columns are roughly 10 diameters tall. Let's take a look at what would happen if you didn't include the pedestal base. Really, for this to be a Corinthian order, you took out the base and still had this entablature. Of course, the entablature is the top part that has the architrave, the frieze, and the cornice. Without the pedestal base, the columns would be probably 14 or 15 diameters tall. In other words, the columns would look way too thin and very out of proportion. It would violate the canon of proportion that the ancient Greeks established. It's interesting that the pedestal base is a necessary feature to proportion the scale of the facades. And so pretty much every little detail, every square dental mold, the profiles that we talked about in classical moldings are based on the dimension of the diameter of the column. Really amazing to think that that one dimension comes from the diameter itself. So really what Alberti did was he took the model of the triumphal arch and turned that into a building. It's a really rare building because there's an exterior space on the facade, which of course covers and contains the entry into the actual basilica behind that. Again, they're probably square proportions, they're probably golden section rectangles. You would have to take this facade and analyze it. The same thing with another Alberti facade, Santa Maria Novella. I like to show the photograph of the actual building relative to the geometric analysis. Again, The proportion of this thing is probably based on a series of squares. You could take, excuse me, the top part of this, that clearly fits into one square. Then the bottom part fits into another square. So the ratio, the proportion is 2 squares, a 1-to-2 ratio. Then again, if you took this further, is that the top part of the cornice probably, if you drew a rectangle, this would probably fit into a golden section rectangle. So what's beautiful about this facade is that it does relate, the parts relate to a larger whole based on geometric principles. So if you look at the angle of the roof slope, it probably is the diagonal that bisects the section of the golden section rectangle. So it's not a case where Alberti took an adjustable triangle and just wanted a nice angle and adjusted it. Of course, he didn't have adjustable triangles back then. They were using slide rules and very basic, drawing tools. But everything is really carefully constructed based on the squares, probably the golden section. So the facade is proportioned using ancient geometric principles. I love to show facades in their best light. This is probably a beautiful in Eastern 10 o'clock in the morning shot versus the kind of vulgar late evening sun. The facades are so beautiful. They're carefully photographed. The mixture of the inlaid marble and of course the spirals on the volutes that transition from the base and of course disguise the roof over the basilica behind that. Just extraordinarily beautiful facades. This is an example of an unfinished church by Alberti. I can't remember which one this one is, but you can actually go back and reconstruct. The building isn't finished or it's completely fragmented. You can see the beginning of the architrave where the arch is. Then of course you can imagine the opening. You can still see the same geometric principles proportioned, the same sort of ideology that this earlier church was done. Of course, the classical order is the Corinthian order, which uses the base. The columns are 10 diameters tall, which of course proportions the entire architrave, frieze, and the cornice. It's interesting when things intersect. If you see the two red lines that intersect each other, it becomes the very midpoint of the pediment on the door. Again, classical orders give a scale to buildings. We've seen the example of the arch of, I think, Constantine. We mentioned that. These are my favorite images. No one thinks that the Pantheon looks like it. These are the back. Everyone, of course, has seen the fronts of the Pantheon in Rome with the columnar order, but the back of it is even more intriguing. What I'm showing you is this kind of a reference to our classical moldings lecture a week and a half ago or so, but the moldings are not simply applied, they're integrated into the wall. You could see the brick striations allow for the marble entablature to tooth back into the wall. And why am I showing this? Because look at this. This is the back of the Parthenon without the classical orders. Pretty much all these buildings were adorned with each classical order. Look at the column is just hanging in front of that. Again, a lot of the ancient Romans or the Italians, they started removing marble entablatures to create other buildings, but we're left with the scale of the wall, the Pantheon, without the classical orders. You can imagine how barbaric looking these buildings are without the classical orders to give the scale and dimension. You can see the structural arch, which would have been completely covered up with the marble entablature. I just think that's a really wonderful picture of the truth about the construction. Of course, then what you can consider the classical orders is kind of a lie to disguise. Of course, it's decorative, it's not structural because we're in ancient Rome. These would have been structural columns in ancient Greece. Just a wonderful picture of the relationship. I'm kind of getting off the subject. Yes, I'm guilty of Googling images. The Google file has some incredible images, but look at the scale of this wall with the composite order. Of course, the composite order is created in the Renaissance. It mixes the Ionic volutes and the Corinthian leaves in one order. This is Villa, I think, Farnese and Caprarola, if I pronounce that correctly. But the walls, of course, if you were to analyze these facades, probably the rectangles are probably golden section proportions. If you took the diagonal of this bay at the end, The same angle would probably be the golden section rectangle, which determines the opening of the windows. And these are just, they've been cleaned and they're beautiful to even look at. Wow, this is just, I love to show these extraordinary facades. This, of course, is Basilica Vicenza by Palladio. Palladio's scale, of course, Palladio and many other architects created their own canons of proportion based on the classical orders. They have their own ideology, but we're still looking at, of course, the base order is either probably the Tuscan or Doric order at the base. Then gradually the second layer would be Ionic. There's a taller order, there was a third level, probably would have been Corinthian. These are Renaissance facades because, of course, the Renaissance were borrowing classical, I don't want to say borrowing, we're reintroducing these into the Western world. But Palladio does really wonderful things with classical architecture, particularly facades that you don't see in true Roman classical architecture. The end bays of the buildings are very specially articulated. Instead of just ending the structural bay with one column, he pairs them as a way of terminating the end of the building, as giving it sort of a beefy sort of end to the building. And again, the end is more articulated because we're not using the same structural bay with the Palladian arch with the circles on either side of it. There's a solid panel. So there's a wonderful little visual, playful language that people really don't pick up on if you're not looking out for it. Of course, you can imagine this structural, the bay is really, oh no, I'm ruining, so let me go back. Okay, so what I'm saying is you can imagine a square that probably fits into the second story bay. There's probably a square for the first level. There's probably overlapping squares. Probably this rectangle where the architrave starts, where the spring line is for the arch, is probably a golden section rectangle. If you were to graphically analyze these things, you would probably see different sort of geometric relationships in each one of these. Again, there's another wonderful Palazzo Cheircati, because he's still using the proper classical proportioning that the ancient Greeks and Romans established with the height of the columns, the Doric order probably 8, the Ionic order probably 8 or 9. But again, he's articulating the ends of the building with paired columns. It's not just the same sort of boring structural columnar bay. He pairs the columns at the end of the building. This is just an extraordinary wall. This is Palazzo Barberini. Of course, this is a Baroque facade by, I think, Bernini. But of course, we're still in the classical language. It's the same sort of classical registering we saw at the Colosseum, the base of the Tuscan order, proportion with the scale of the columns. The diameter of the columns. The second layer is Ionic. The top layer is Corinthian. The same thing with the Colosseum. Of course, this is probably 1500, probably 1560 in Rome and the Renaissance or the Baroque. Of course, he's borrowing the same proportioning system from the ancient classical world, the same Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian for the columnar order. And the sunlight on these facades, it's just extraordinary. I like to quote, the modern architect Louis Kahn said, the sunlight in Rome forgives all its ugliness, if there is such a thing as something ugly in Rome. And I love also what Edward Hopper, the American painter, said about light coming in through an upper story. It's like there's something magical about the way light animates the facades, especially the upper story. These are just absolutely extraordinary walls. And this is just, heaven on earth that people can create these things just really using ancient geometric principles. A lot of people ask me, well, which comes first? Do the columns come first and then the building? Do you design the columns first with the classical orders and then you design a building? Obviously not. I think they're both interchangeable. This is Michelangelo's plan for the Senate buildings in one of Rome's tallest hill, the Campidoglio. This is the Capitoline Hill Senate buildings. Again, of course, the plan was established first, and then Michelangelo, and of course, many other architects, would of course articulate and design the facades based on the plan layout. So we didn't design the facades first. The plan comes first, and then of course the facades are designed later. And what I was showing you, these are just absolutely extraordinary facades. What I was saying in the last lecture is that Michelangelo kind of flip things over and reverse things and inverted things. And by that, I mean, normally the ground layer of columns would have been probably Tuscan or Doric, the simplest order. But of course, he flips things around. The Ionic order is on the ground floor. Then he mixes the classical order. He introduces the giant order, which of course, the Corinthian capitals bypass all the floors, and you have these monumental sized columns. And look at that wall. And he has a very playful language because there's seashells carved in what's called the arch tympanum above the frieze inside the pediment. What I like to do, I think it's about 12:30. This technically is roughly the end of the lecture. What I like to show is it's really hard for me or anyone to show really images of true Roman classical buildings because a lot of those don't really exist. When I did my research, I would highly encourage people to look at Hadrian's Villa, the reconstruction, because what you're looking at is a very playful language of architecture. Of course, this is the villa designed several miles outside of Rome. His wonderful architect, Apollodorus, I think was his name, had these really playful languages about the way the classical orders kind of interlock each other. You know, instead of just covering this, this is actually the end of the famous canopus, that large gallery you've seen in postcards that have those kind of nymphs that are around that body of water. Of course, it's mostly in ruin, but just the way the architect treats the semicircular arch with, of course, the frieze, the classical order that continues all the way across the arch and has a really wonderful layered system of layers in each one of the facades. This is just one very simple image, but if you look at the reconstruction drawings or images of Hadrian's Villa, that's a very wonderful, playful language of the true Roman classical language of architecture. What I've shown you is Renaissance architecture. I haven't shown you a lot of true Roman classical, except for the example of the Colosseum. Of course, you can't see the entire building's envelope because a lot of it was damaged by an earthquake and due to pillage and the Romans actually taking marble off to make other buildings. There's some references, and also what I was going to say is if your kids or your friends watch Assassin's Creed as the game, those reconstruction videos they did a fine job in recreating all the original orders, the way ancient Rome looks like, probably from 300 BC up until the 1st century AD. It's a really wonderful video to even watch because you can see all the buildings reconstructed in one phenomenal video model. I'm just going to end. I'm going to go back to the beginning, and I just like to show that I just think it's remarkable that the relationship of Greek space and structure versus Roman space and structure. You know, I'm really not talking about proportion at this point. I'm just talking about the fact that, you know, look how many columns you would have to span an opening or to create a space like this. Now, these are marble and stone beams. If you're using wood, they can span much further. So when we look at this example to proportion the spacing of, hold on a minute. I'm sorry, I'm losing my place. Hold on just a moment. Here we go. Okay. So, you know, well, it says Roman Doric. Of course, you know, this is actually showing you how far you can span with, of course, the Greek language without building with arches. You really can't span that far with stone or marble beams because the structural integrity won't allow it to span that far. So when you look at Roman spacing, it's much larger because we're building with arches. So it's an interesting dynamic that the materials completely change the language of architecture in the Roman societies, because if you look at the ancient baths, those buildings are enormous sized buildings, which yielded much larger columnar orders. Okay, I think we can open up the next 30 minutes for questions, and I can flip back to some of the slides. So why don't we go ahead and do that?
Okay, question came through on the chat that says, will we be covering examples in the future of how composition is approached in regards to starting with the orders or sketching geometric guidelines?
Yes, I'm teaching, I think we're getting the curriculum ready. I'm teaching drawing lessons probably not until June. But if there's a strong interest, if like we could, maybe for the next lecture, we could take a 30-minute break and start actually drawing something. I'm willing to do that. Because we're still kind of getting the classes organized. But yes, there will be some examples where I can show you how to start drawing the composition manually, because it's really hard to understand how to start drawing things if you're just looking at slides in a lecture.
So if you have any questions, just feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to ask.
Could you remind us how to find that midpoint in the square if you didn't have like a ruler?
Yes, of course. Let me go back to the golden section. So the first thing to do is just to draw a square at any size. And then you'll take the midpoint of the bottom chord or the bottom horizontal line. And then of course you'll take your compass from the midpoint to the end, and eventually the compass will determine the size of the rectangle.
But if you didn't, like the ancient Greeks, they didn't have like a ruler or whatever, then like isn't there a way that you can draw lines to find it?
They use what's called the string method, and I don't have an example of that. They would take strings to determine things. So they probably didn't have modern compasses, but you can make your own compass with just the string. They would take the string and swing the arc outward. They didn't have a compass.
I think that, but not the arc, but the actual midpoint of that bottom part of the square.
Well, now they did have primitive scales. They did have, scales with different increments on it. I'm sure they were able to easily find the midpoint. But you're asking how to construct that without using modern tools?
Yeah, I think that we've, like, at some point I've gone through it where you can use like intersecting lines or something like that.
Yeah, there is a way to create the midpoint and without using the compass. I think if you see some videos of the string method, they take strings, of course, because they probably didn't have, stellar compasses from Mazel art to draw these things. But yeah, I can email you some examples of how to do this without, modern tools. Yeah.
So there's another question in the chat asking, how are these principles represented in a floor plan where there is a proportion of length, width, and height?
Okay, let me go back down to, because I just really talked about facades. So, this is just, I don't have an analytical plan of this, but if you take the floor plan, I'm sure Michelangelo used the system of squares to proportion each one of these bays. Probably some of the rectangles are golden sections, but the plan can still use the same compositional strategy that I showed you on the facades. I just don't have examples of plan elements showing that. But yeah, the geometric principles can still be drawn in plan versus the facade. Yeah, so a lot of the plans, of course, were using the same compositional strategies. I just don't have an example of this in that. And also, I was going to say, in terms of geometry, if you look at the Piazza Campidoglio with that Michelangelo design, what this technically is kind of an early Mannerist tiling pattern on the floor. The Italians wouldn't even let Michelangelo construct that because it was too radical when the buildings were first built. It took them about 100 years later to accept this and actually implement that plan. It was definitely a radical sort of move on Michelangelo's part to do that. So it was so controversial that they didn't even allow him to build that until much later. Yeah, I think I probably should have had more plans on here, but I'm sorry I don't. Anyone have any other questions? I'm sure you guys do.
I think that might be it. No one else has chimed in on the chat.
Okay. I guess I was going to add any revelations. I'm sure you probably haven't seen all these buildings. Anything that kind of struck your imagination or your kind of excitement for architecture? Hopefully, for the most part, I think most people have seen this in their, I'm sure you've taken an art history class or architecture class, an introduction, that, there are some compositional rules to determine the spacing and the height of things.
We did get a question from Margaret asking, how can we apply these principles with the modern architecture that seems to be prevalent today?
Margaret, are you referring to modern architecture or are you referring to contemporary architecture? You think that those are two different things? I think when you talk about modern architecture, you're talking about Frank Gehry, or which architects are you? Because I wasn't going to go in that lecture, but that's an interesting question. What sort of architects are you referring to when you say modern?
Contemporary, what we are designing today.
That's a good question. I teach my students that to stay away from looking at contemporary architecture, particularly Frank Gehry and a lot of the kind of European New Age. They're not using any compositional. They're definitely not using the system of the golden section or sort of any compositional strategies. And you can tell because the buildings look like they're wavy blobs. And for the most part, they're letting the computer digital software determine all the forms and all the design decisions, which I find really disturbing. So, that's a good question because I just don't see, I mean, when we talk about modern architecture, Louis Kahn, Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe, of course, they did use classical principles to determine the composition of things, the buildings, the plan organization, the facades. But now, contemporary architects are like Morphosis and I mentioned Frank Gehry, and then some Stephen Hall, some radical avant-garde architects are not even using this at all, which I kind of find a really big shame because it's just when I see contemporary architects, I'm looking at a language of chaos. There's really no organizational structure. There's no scale to things. The only contemporary architect that's probably doing this, I mentioned Stephen Hall, is like when you look at Stephen Hall's work, you can see the digital blob, but then you can, of course, see the sort of Corbusian, grid that has, of course, parts of the golden section just as hints in the building. But that is a good question. Now, of course, there's modern classicists, which, of course, they're still building in the language of classical architecture, which does use these principles. But that's a good question. Did that kind of answer some things?
Yes, that answered her question.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I live around the corner from the Pro Science Museum, which is designed by Morphosis, and Tom Main was really the founder of that company. And if you look at the building of that, it has kind of a nice geometric cube. Of course, the building is actually a cube, but underneath is that this really complex language of these digital fingers that anchor the building to the ground. And what I'm looking at is every time I walk into, because the entry I think is the most important thing in a building, the experience of entering These, of course, if you look at ancient classical, of course, the entry is very monumental. So when I look at the entry sequence of some of the contemporary buildings, they're letting, excuse me, the contemporary digital world determine everything. And I quote Tom Main as saying, "I haven't looked at the floor plan in years." I mean, you can tell when I enter that building, there's really, the poetics are lost about, being in that space, having a reason for being, and it's visibly exciting. Same thing with Frank Gehry entries. It's mind blowing. It's really exciting. But then I think the meaning and the poetry kind of gets lost with all the curves and angles, and there's so many different places to go. There's really not a destination point. But then there is parts of it have that basic cube, which thank God the cubes and the rectangles are there in parts of it. Because otherwise it's just, I mean, certainly don't have projects like that in my portfolio, but it's just a very confusing language of architecture. It's almost like visiting a video game, which is flashing out, which I think is exciting and great. But it's just, I think that the meaning has gotten lost with all the digital moves. That's a very good question. Well, we have about 10 more minutes. I think based on some of the questions and comments, I think for the next class on next Tuesday, I think I'll give a lecture for half of it. I think I'll have you do some drawing exercises in your sketchbook. So you're not hearing me talk for an hour. But I'm sure other people have questions about anything.
We do. We have one more question.
Sure.
I think it's from Paul. I can't see the name in the chat. And it says, contemporary architecture appeals to the senses while classical appeals to the mind. Do you agree?
Yes, I think they both appeal to both senses, but I think more specifically, that's a good question. I think when I look at a Renaissance or classical building, my visceral reaction is it's beautiful. Of course, because I'm seeing layers of what I'm talking about, beauty as defined as relationships. But I think you're right. Contemporary architecture is more about the experience. And you said, what did you say, the senses?
Contemporary architecture appeals to the senses,
Yes.
while classical appeals to the mind.
I think that's a good statement, yeah, because I think contemporary architecture is more about experience and senses. Because you're not going to walk in front of a contemporary building and see, oh, that facade is beautiful. It's really hard because the sort of, I want to say, proportioning, the compositional attributes are kind of lost. And it depends on which contemporary architecture you're referring to. But yes, I think I would agree with you on that.
If there aren't other questions, could we spend some time working on just like constructing the Fibonacci spiral?
Yeah, of course. Let me go back to, if you want to start drawing this in your sketchbooks, let me go back to that. Well, let's take a look at this one first quickly. It's pretty relatively easy to draw. And then if you want to try to draw the Fibonacci spiral on your own, let's look at this carefully. You guys can see the mouse on my screen, right? Michelle, can we see that?
Yes.
Okay. So what you would do is to draw this, you would start with draw one square below that, draw another square twice the height, and just repeat the squares starting from right. You'll do a right-hand spiral. You don't even need to draw the spiral. You'll simply just draw the squares. So then to draw the curve, what to do is you'll take the corner and make that the radius of the curve. So let's look at the radius of square number 1, which would be here. Radius number 2 would be here. Radius number 3 would start here. 5 here. And of course, this is a terrible sketch because I drew a rectangle for number 8 instead of a square, but you can still do that. I would start drawing a very small square using the system of squares and then try to go back and draw the curve that creates the Fibonacci spiral. I'm sorry, hold on a minute.
Could you trace where the rectangle is in each of these parts of the spiral with your mouse?
Yes, let's take a look at the collection 2, 3, and 5. Let's take a look at that rectangle. So let's take a look. If you'd like to take square number 5, you drew the midpoint, then you would take your compass and draw the other end of that. So that probably would be a golden section rectangle. So the first thing I would do is draw 1, 2, 3, 4. Just draw these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 squares. And you can probably figure out that the collection of squares would make a golden section rectangle.
Is that the smallest golden rectangle in this spiral? Is that combination?
It would probably occur here between 2 and 1.
Mm-hmm.
Then probably the same diagonal from 2 and 1 would be the same diagonal from 3 and 5. You can try to figure that out. They're not going to be exactly the same, but they'll be very close. And was it Andrea that was asking me that?
Yeah, I took the picture and
Oh,
we'll work on that on my own.
yeah. How are you coming along with that?
Oh, I'll do that later.
Oh,
I've
okay.
been through these proportions before. It's just, I don't know, always have to feel like I'm starting from the beginning when I'm learning it again.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, Andrea, if you look at this image, you can see the Parthenon facade, right? You know, what I would do is take your adjustable triangle and see this angle, the diagonal from this corner to this corner probably will be the same angle as the largest one, like that one. The same thing with this one from here to here. It should be very close.
So there is a question asking, is the golden section the same as Corbusier's golden ratio? I may have pronounced that wrong.
No, you're right. Well, yeah, because Le Corbusier did use the golden section rectangle as compositional strategies in plans and facades, yes. Now, what Corbusier did was he introduces the modular system, which of course loosely is based on the proportion of the human body and the golden section. Yes, so of course, Le Corbusier did use golden section. And could you repeat the question one more time just to make sure?
Sure, give me 1 second to find it. It says, is the golden section the same as his ratio, his golden ratio?
Well, because there is really only one golden ratio, but Le Corbusier, what he did with the golden section, he reworked it with, introduced it into what's called his modular proportioning system. So the modular is a mixture of the proportion of the human with, of course, the golden section. So yes, they're both the same. Yeah. That's a hard question to answer. but he did use golden section, yes. Yes, actually, Le Corbusier, his modular memory system was so well received that he actually got to meet Albert Einstein and present it to him. So, and what I was going to tell, I wasn't sure if I was allowed to talk about modern architecture, but I'm teaching modern architecture at UTA Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, and classical architecture on Tuesdays. And I still like to associate modern and classical architecture as very relative based on the compositional strategies. I only teach contemporary ideology later when we get into senior design in graduate school. But for my undergraduate students, they have to understand that compositional strategies are very important, especially for beginners. But those are some very, very good questions. I think it's right at 1 o'clock. Michelle, are there any other questions or?
No, I don't see any other questions.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for participating. I'm going to be doing, you'll get an invitation in an email for the class on Tuesday, and we're going to be doing some drawing exercises on Tuesday. You can use your sketchbook. You can get a small little board with paper and pencil, and we'll do some exercises. Thanks everyone for participating. I appreciate your attendance.
Thank you, everyone.